Hamstring injuries are one of the more common that we see in sports, particularly in sports that require sprinting. The problem with injuries is not just the time that you spend out, the time that you're not allowed to, or that you're not able to compete, the time that you're not able to train. More importantly, the problem with injuries is that the biggest predictor of an injury is a prior injury. So once you are injured, you now have a greater likelihood of being injured again, and who's to say that the injury won't be worse the second time? We need to think about things related to both, what to do once you're already injured. How do you rehab from it? How do you come out of it and hopefully set yourself up to not get injured again? But arguably of even greater importance is how can we prevent injuries from the start? And I'm not here to say that I have all the answers, but through experience, I can give you some idea of things that I've done and things that other people have done that have been useful to them, and also give you some insights from the research that's out there dealing with this subject of hamstring injuries. When it comes to the negative impacts of something like a hamstring strain, there's four main categories that I would say are relevant to consider and know, so that way when you go about rehabbing from the injury, you can think about these things. First of all, we see strength deficits, so the ability to produce force in the injured limb is going to decrease. For weeks to months, the athlete will show strength deficits in the injured limb, and in some cases in the non-injured limb as well. We also see velocity deficits. Much of the negative impact related to an injury like a hamstring strain are the resultant deficits in movement velocity that we see. In general, movement velocity is the last quality that you gain back throughout the recovery process, and that's one of those factors that I would say is really important as far as how you progress through your rehab. One is going to be range of motion, the other is going to be velocity. Those two are arguably, the most important factors for you to watch, take into account, and monitor throughout your rehab process. And they can give you a good indication of how well you're recovering from that injury. We also see inhibition of movement. Some athletes show bilateral strength deficits, like I alluded to earlier, even after a unilateral injury. So that means they have weakness in both legs after injuring one leg. This suggests some neurological inhibition of movement. The brain, once it senses that there has been a tissue injury, and once you realize it, so both consciously and subconsciously, there can be some inhibition going on system-wide that is going to cause you to not be able to produce as much force, move as fast, hit certain positions, etc. I would argue that one of the biggest negative impacts, other than the risk of re-injury, of being injured, is this inhibition of movement. It's going to make it a lot harder to hit those times that you were hitting before the injury. The biggest pain in the ass of being injured is that inhibition of movement. And if you don't take that into account in your rehab process and you really work on overcoming that inhibition, and instead you protect it like a wound that you want to cover up because you don't want to touch it, you don't want to feel the pain, you don't want to deal with it, that's going to cause you problems in the long run. Last but not least, we have scar tissue formation. Once you injure a muscle, you're going to get scar tissue forming in that area. Scar tissue, is going to be present indefinitely in some cases, or all, I don't know, but at least in some cases it can be present indefinitely. Scar tissue alters force transmission pathways, so if we were to visualize how force is being produced within a muscle, the pathways in which the muscle contraction is happening and where that force is being generated will change. The tendon and the aponeurosis compliance gets affected, so we see negative effects there. The muscle will deform in different ways after injury because of this scar tissue, so you could think of deformation as like elasticity, for example, would be one type of deformation. As the leg opens up and the muscle gets put on stretch, it is now deforming during that. Well, how that muscle deforms when tension is put on it or something like that will change after you have some scar tissue formation as a result of injury. And also the scar tissue is one of the big things that increases the risk of re-injury, particularly during active lengthening. So if you have a bunch of scar tissue built up in your hamstring, you're sprinting, your leg's coming through to the front side, the knee is opening up, the hamstring's being loaded. Well, as it's being loaded, that scar tissue cannot handle, that force that's being generated by the muscle, and something's going to give because it cannot lengthen at the same rate or to the same degree that healthy muscle tissue can. and so you risk re-injury because that tissue itself becomes a weak point wherever that scar tissue had formed. There is some debate over, the phase of the sprint cycle where hamstring injuries happen. Some people think it's the late swing phase. Some people think it's the early stance phase. Either case, we should be able to prevent hamstring injuries in some cases, or hopefully most cases. And I don't think we need to get too, caught up in whether it's just before you hit the ground or when you're on the ground. We can leave that for the research community and the biomechanists to argue over. But we as practitioners, we as people who are training for the sprints, coaching people in the sprints, coaching other athletes who sprint, coaching other athletes who do other things who have the risk of injuring some tissue, we need to step a little bit outside of the minutia and consider, whether it's this or that, we need to have a way to deal with it. So if we think about the hamstring action that's happening during the late swing phase, we have a strong eccentric contraction, generally at submaximal length, meaning the leg does not fully extend when it's on the front side, when that leg has come through to the front side and is going to reverse back down to the ground. The knee does not completely lock out, so the hamstring is undergoing an intense eccentric contraction, but not at maximal length. It's doing this to decelerate the shank or the shin, so as the shin swings forward, the hamstrings are decelerating that, and then they're going to re-accelerate the leg back down to the ground. And this is producing a high force knee flexion moment. That eccentric contraction that's happening, that's the time where people are at a high risk of injury during the late swing phase. And this is why a lot of people think most hamstring injuries happen during the late swing phase, because of that intense eccentric action that's happening. If we think about the opposing moments that are happening, or the opposing movements that are happening at this same point in time regarding the late swing phase, the vastus muscles, so the quads, they begin to activate at the end of the swing, and they produce a weak contraction. And the hip flexors are basically inactive at this point, so there's really not a whole lot of internal opposing forces going on, or opposing moments, specifically in the late swing phase. Externally, there is some opposing force of air resistance, which theoretically would assist the hamstring in decelerating the shin, because if the shin is swinging forward, air resistance is blocking it. That might help slow it down a little bit, but I think it's pretty minimal, the effect there. On the flip side, if we think about the early stance phase, we have a strong concentric contraction, which resists the opposing force, of the ground under you. And it helps produce a hip extensor moment. So the hamstrings are assisting in extending the hip once you're on the ground. Not only are they extending the hip in anticipation of hitting the ground to strike the ground, but also once you're on the ground, they're helping produce that hip extensor moment. Internally during this, the vastus muscles are increasing their activation during early stance, and they're producing a stronger contraction than they did during the late swing phase. And the rectus femoris, the big quad muscle, it starts to contract as well. This activity in the quads that are happening when you hit the ground could be internally opposing the hamstrings, and therefore have some impact on hamstring injury during the early stance phase. Externally, there are potentially large hip flexor and knee extensor joint reaction moments. So if you think of the ground reaction force vector that you're dealing with when you're on the ground, it is anterior to the knee and hip joints due to a forefoot strike. So there is the potential for having some intense external opposing forces, basically, that the hamstring is having to deal with. And maybe this could also have some impact on whether or not you get injured in the early stance phase. But either way, I don't think we need to really argue about whether it happens at this point or that point. More importantly, I think we should think about what we can do within each of those subcategories of when someone might get injured, and use that information to help us decide how we're going to try and prevent injury. So for the late swing phase, what should come to mind when we have a strong eccentric contraction with the leg on the front side of the body and the knee almost locking out but not fully locking out? Well, maybe we should be doing some lengthening exercises on those hamstrings to strengthen them for that specific movement. On the flip side, during the early stance phase, we have intense concentric contractions happening, which help propel the body over the ground, basically. Well, What should we do to maybe prevent that? Maybe we should do some concentric hamstring strengthening or strengthen the other muscles that are going to support the hamstrings and what they do, the glutes, the adductors, the core. It shouldn't be rocket science. If you think about what is happening when someone's getting injured, probably if we strengthen in that direction, it'll help in some way to prevent injury in the future. Now, as far as going through an actual rehab program, there are some studies out there that look at hamstring injuries, and they've compared different methods of rehabbing the athletes from those injuries. And just want to talk about those a little bit and give some comments on them. So in the first study, they compared progressive agility and trunk stability training with eccentric strength training and sprinting as, two separate programs. So they took athletes, they threw them in progressive agility and trunk stability program. They took other athletes, threw them in the eccentric strength and sprinting program, and they looked at, what happens. They found that the results were pretty much similar. I believe this was in soccer players. So, they're not going to be sprinting to the same level that a competitive, national level sprinter will be operating at. There might be some things to consider there, like a football player, for example, could go back onto the field and play even if they weren't fully recovered, because depending on the position, they may not end up in a compromising position for the leg very often. That would likely re-injure the hamstring. They're probably not moving at a very high velocity all the time. So they may not need, as perfect of a rehab program as someone who is running, 9.9 in the 100. Those are two different populations of people, and they will require different levels of, preparedness to get back into their sport, different levels of rehabilitation to not have the same risk of injury. Not saying you should go back and play when you're still injured, but there are differences depending on the population that you're looking at. Now, my thoughts on this was, performing a wide variety of trunk stability, progressive agility, progressive sprinting, and eccentric strength training is likely best in order to fully restore function in the hamstrings. So if both of these training modalities or approaches to rehabbing the hamstring showed similar effect, then maybe we should combine them. And in my mind, why wouldn't you include some trunk stability work when rehabbing the hamstrings? Why wouldn't you include eccentric strength training and agility and sprinting? They should all be a part of the program, because that's going to give you a wider variety of ways to hit the hamstrings and overcome those inhibition or the inhibition of movement that you might be experiencing. And so I see why not just do it all, right? We have another study here that looked at elite Swedish sprinters and jumpers. They returned to play in an average of 49 days using a lengthen-focused rehabilitation program, which, if you're going to ask me what I think is the best, if we had to just choose one thing, and I would say it's a lengthening-focused rehab protocol. This was in comparison to an average of 86 days using conventional training. So the lengthening group, they would do things like a single leg RDL with no weight, so lengthening the hamstring. They did other similar types of exercises. The other group did, hamstring curls or typical concentric training, we could call it, because of the nature of hamstring injuries, where they, at least a lot of the time, happen during active lengthening. It would follow logically that the lengthening approach would work better. And in this case, with elite Swedish sprinters and jumpers, it did, to the tune of almost, I wouldn't say in half as much time, but maybe took 60% of the time or something like that. One of you out there probably has a calculator, so you could calculate what 49 days out of 86 days is, but it's a significant difference in return to play. So that's something we need to consider, right? So my thoughts on that: due to the nature of sprinting, the hamstrings must be able to lengthen at high velocities. As such, it would follow logically that rehabilitating the injury with an emphasis on lengthening exercises would improve return to play. Consider using slide board exercises, body weight loaded exercises such as a single leg good morning or single leg RDL, knee extension while holding the hip in a flexed position, etc. Another study, which it showed that isometric strength and mobility are likely to improve before the MRI shows full recovery from injury. So as pain reduces over time and strength increases over time, we need to progress the velocity of movement slowly. We need to not rush into moving as fast as possible, and instead, if you could progress at a rate that we'll call 100, being like the fastest you're able to progress. Maybe we should be in the 80 to 90% range, so we're not pushing it too hard. We are progressing, we are moving faster each week, but not to the extent that is the max amount that we can progress, because we don't want to re-injure ourselves. We want to, if anything, give our body as much time as it possibly needs before we come back and are going full blast on the track or on the field. And therefore, we need to take this into consideration that even if you feel good, your isometric strength is good, your mobility is good, the pain is gone, that doesn't mean that the injury is fully recovered. That just means your ability to perceive those sensations related to it have come to a point where you don't notice any real problem. Because of this, we need to be considerate of whether or not someone may feel good but isn't fully recovered, and therefore, day one that you don't feel pain and your mobility is good and your strength is good, that is not the day that you go try to break your 30-meter fly record or your 150 record. That's the day that maybe you get back on the track and you start getting into what would be considered sprinting, but it's not at full blast. It's not at a distance that makes you really fatigued. I remember one time I asked Dan Paff what is a good idea of, when an athlete is ready to get back into full-on training, and I believe what he said was 10 by 50 meters at 80%. If an athlete can do 10 50s at 80% approximately, then they're probably okay to get back into what we would consider full-on sprint training. If you can't do that, probably not ready yet. That sort of points to this similar line of thought where just because strength and mobility are good, just because pain isn't there, doesn't mean you're fully good to go. You got to be able to prove that you're good to go, and one of those ways would be something like that, 10 by 50 at 80%. If you could do that with no pain, your form is good, and you don't feel terrible the next day, that's a good sign. If you can't get through the whole workout, it starts to tighten up on you, starts to grab, as they say, that's a sign you're not ready yet. Just because you feel good at 60% doesn't mean you're good to go at 90%. Now, say that you're already injured, right? And you're trying to figure out, all right, how do I rehab? Well, here are some considerations that we can, take into account, take note of, that might help during your recovery process. So one thing you want to do is palpate the length of pain that you have. Palpate is like massage or feel with your fingers. Palpate the length of pain. So what physical length from point A to point B that length of pain is on your leg, and take note of those changes that happen over time. So maybe week 1, the length of pain, you could measure it and it's 8 inches. Well, maybe 2 weeks later you measure it again and it's down to 4 inches. That shows you a couple things. One, that you're probably recovering, and B, it'll narrow down to where the biggest impact of the injury was. So you can sort of, without having an MRI, the next best thing that we could probably use is where does that center of pain end up as the length of pain or the area of pain starts to reduce? Where does it stick around the longest? That's probably the area that you injured the most. At least that would make sense to me. Length of pain will decrease with time and can be used as one of many yardsticks of recovery. Another thing, we want to measure outer range strength and mobility. So this is the leg at longer lengths. It could be the leg out to the side, the leg across the body. What is that end range of motion we can hit? And what is the strength at those extremes of range of motion? Is there pain? Where does the pain start? You don't want to go past that point of pain necessarily, but you do want to find where the body's starting to inhibit movement. Take note of that, because that's a way for you to progress. If you can only get to 45 degrees, 2 weeks later you're at 70 degrees of leg, movement or whatever, well, that's probably a good sign that you're recovering. So we want to track that outer range strength and mobility, the end range of motion, so that we can track over time how things are going and adjust rehab accordingly. Third, we want to measure maximum hip flexion with active knee extension. So if you think about laying on your back, lifting your leg up, you're driving your knee toward your head and you're kicking your foot up toward the sky. So you're getting those 2 joint hamstring muscles to lengthen. That's a good way to measure range of motion, and it's better than just the straight leg raise. Because when we look at human movement, what do we see? We see the hip flexion happening, and then we see the knee extension. If that's when people might be getting hurt a lot of the time during sprinting, that can be or that will be the type of motion that will be inhibited. And therefore, if we track progress in that type of motion, we can probably get a good idea of where rehab is going. Last but not least, we want to progressively increase load and velocity over time, with velocity being the most carefully applied mechanical variable. So I mentioned this earlier. We do want to increase loads. We do want to go to bigger ranges of motion. The easiest way to get hurt again after you've been hurt already is to hit a range of motion at too high of a velocity. You might be able to go to a certain range of motion at a lower velocity. You may be able to move the leg at a certain velocity, but only through a limited range of motion. So I think within yourself as an athlete, or if you're monitoring people as a coach, you should be paying attention to progressing their velocity over time in a pretty conservative manner, so that way you're not pushing them too far and sending them back to Snap City when you could have just taken your foot off the pedal a little bit and they would have been fine. Velocity is probably, at least for me, it's the biggest, like I said earlier, yardstick of recovery. It's a factor that is highly influenced or highly impacted by being injured. And from personal experience, I pretty much only get injured when I'm moving fast. You really got to monitor velocity and be very hesitant to increase velocity. It's not that you don't increase velocity, you have to push the boundary, but you don't want to push beyond the boundary. So if anything, be a little bit more conservative on how you progress velocity, and instead focus on getting them as strong as possible, as mobile as possible, and let velocity progress on its own at a natural rate, not one that you artificially pound it with a hammer to make them move faster. As far as some recommendations that I could personally give you, these are based on my experience, reading some studies, but mainly experience. These aren't prescriptions. I'm not a physical therapist, but I can tell you what's worked for me, what's worked for other people that I know, and maybe it's something you could consider. So on the strength end of things, I would say the first thing is going to be developing isometric strength. In my mind, this is like, say you're laying on a table and you've hurt your hamstring, you're laying on your back. Well, you could just, dig your heel into that table that you're laying on and see, does it hurt? Can I do this? Okay, it hurts a 5 out of 10. All right, well, I'm going to do a set for 5 seconds, see how that feels. It's okay. All right, let's try 10 seconds. Then you could do something like get into that, hip flexion, knee extension position. And you could have someone hold your foot, or press your foot into their hand and do an isometric contraction there and see. That's the first thing you want to do, because if you're injured and there's damage in the tissue, yeah, we need to stimulate it with some force, some tension, but we need to do that in the most simple way, and the most simple way would be an isometric exercise. I'm not saying that you should really use any load. It's just you're gauging based on pain and the inhibition that your body throws back at you as a guiding light for how intense to make that isometric contraction. Once you can do isometric contractions with, a high intensity and you don't feel like there's a problem, that's a great sign that you're recovering. Stage 2 of strength development would be eccentric strength. So this is where we want to load the lengthening aspect. This could be getting into, you could just sit with a partner. You could lay on your stomach, pick your foot up, and as they push your foot back to the ground, you resist that pushing at 50% effort until it hits the ground. Come back up, maybe resist at 60 or 70%, and you progress that way. Another one could be in a hamstring curl machine. You use 2 legs to come up, and then you go down slowly on 1 leg at a time. You wouldn't want to use a lot of load if you're using a machine, because you don't want to go get yourself into a compromising position. But, that's another way to do it. You could do a single leg back extension, do that eccentrically. You could do any number of exercises. But the point is we want to lengthen the hamstring under some sort of load so that we're preparing it for the type of action that is likely to injure it. So that way we can strengthen it, and when it encounters that action in sport, you don't get injured. The last progression of strength would be to get into stretch shortening cycle movements. So this is just your typical movements, jumping, sprinting, doing a med ball throw, or just basically movements that are using all directions of the movement, or all phases of contraction, I should say. So this may be you're doing a hamstring curl, but you're going down and up and down and up and down and up. You're doing the full movement. These may sound like fancy terms, but really it's just contracting with no joint movement and no muscle shortening, and then you want to load it while the muscle's lengthening, and then we want to load it when the muscle does both shortening and lengthening. Pretty simple when you kind of look at it that way, right? As far as movement competence goes, the first goal is just pain-free, uninhibited walking. So you want to be able to walk and not be in a bunch of pain. Second, we want to get to the point where we can jog, do low-speed drills, and be hitting full ranges of motion in the movements that we target. Then you want to increase movement velocity over time while maintaining your mobility, hitting full ranges of motion, and letting velocity be the main factor that you're progressing. Once you've got the pain-free, uninhibited walking, the jogging, the low-speed drills, full range of motion movement, you want to increase the speed of the movement in the drills, go from jogging to running, running to cantering, and from cantering to sprinting. I would say prevention is really the biggest thing. So just like you want to hit isometric strength, eccentric strength, stretch shortening cycle strength in your rehab protocol, you also want to do that in your prehab protocol. You don't want to just wait till you've been injured to do eccentric strength training. You have to do this in your day-to-day programming. Second of all, I would say if there's anything that's going to get you injured in the sprinting world, it's going to be doing too much high-intensity, high-velocity stuff in too short of a period. Because if your muscle tone gets too high and your tendons are really strong, well, your muscle is probably going to be the thing that fails on you. You need to be considerate of how many times in the last, week or 2 weeks or whatever, 3 days, have you been doing things like depth jumps, sprinting fast, max effort lifts, or max velocity lifts, things that are fast and high intensity. You have to monitor that, because if you get too tense, basically, too tonal, you're going to get into a position where you're just too stiff and something's going to bust on you. So part of prevention is not only the strength aspect, strength training and making sure the tissue's healthy, doing some mobility work's probably good too, but also you have to monitor your programming so that you're not programming yourself into your next injury. I would say if we target creating a well-rounded athlete, a mixture of some, slow movements, some faster movements, then you're going to be better off. I think we need to be hitting end ranges of motion and moving slowly but with a pretty good load on there. And that could be something that might help prevent injury in the long run. Recently I injured my adductor on my left leg. So what have I been doing? Well, the first week I basically focused on, I would put a barbell on my back, I put my foot up on a box, have my injured leg on the ground. I did both sides, but just to visualize, I got my injured leg on the ground, front leg up on a box. So it looks like I'm doing sort of a lunge, but in the, the sprinter takeoff position, leaving the ground or whatever. I focused on getting tension through the area that was hurt, from my toe that was on the ground, up through the leg, through the hips to the other leg that's up on the box. And I just sort of hung out there to feel, okay, if I tilt my foot this way, I feel it slightly differently. Or if I change my posture a little bit, I feel it in a different way. Over the course of a week, the pain went away. I was able to load that exercise up higher, and I was able to get to the point where I was back, doing drills and maybe 75% effort running and sprinting back on the track in 10 days maybe. The whole focus was, where did I get injured? Well, I got injured when my hip was fully extended and I was reversing the leg forward. So that's clearly the weak point. So how about I get in that position and I, with a load that I know I can handle and, a movement that is not moving at all to start with, just an isometric position I'm holding in, load that spot. And by doing that, it felt a lot better real quick, and then I progressed to doing that with movement into it. Then I progressed to doing that with, stepping up into a high box step up from that position. So I progressed from the isometric with an eccentric component because I was at a fully lengthened position. The muscle wasn't lengthening actively during the movement, but I was at the most lengthened point and did an isometric there. So I targeted lengthening, or at least a long muscle length, and the isometric strength, and then I progressed accordingly. So as far as a hamstring injury, you can come up with the exercises, but you want to target that fully lengthened position, and you want to start slow. And then once you're in the, once you're out of it, or if you haven't been injured yet, think of how you can incorporate that type of training, maybe in a circuit. Maybe you do a circuit on a lower intensity day where you're hitting these deep ranges of motion, you're moving kind of slow, but you're getting into those compromising positions and teaching your body and your brain, hey, we can handle this. And then you might progress that over time to where you're able to do that with a little bit more load or a little bit more velocity, and you can prevent these injuries before they happen. Because if you can prevent the injuries, then your overall risk of being injured is lower. If you don't get injured, you have a lower injury risk. That doesn't mean you sit on the couch, do nothing until you're injured. It means you prevent it. And then if you are injured, you take into consideration these recommendations I've suggested in the video or from another source that you trust. Prevention is key, and I can't express that enough to you guys. If anything's worked for you in your own injury rehab, maybe it's a certain modality, there's all kinds of other things we could talk about, ranging from, dry needling to PRP to all kinds of stuff that you could use to recover. Probably not all that we need to talk about here. If there's anything like that you've found interesting or useful, please comment about it. Let us know. We're all in it together here. We're all trying to run faster and stay healthy. So contribute what you can if you have something to say. If you like this video, please subscribe. Check out my website, sprintingworkouts.com. I got programs on there. Hopefully they won't get you injured. And if you have any questions, let me know. I may or may not get back to you, but I will do my best. I promise that. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Hope you have a great day. Hope you're healthy and you can stay healthy and have a great season this upcoming year. This is Cody Bidlow with sprintingworkouts.com signing off.